Today, I have a panel who have joined me to discuss the Kincora boys' home scandal in Northern Ireland. If you're aware of this scandal, you may think this is historic and already appropriately dealt with, but I can assure you that is not the case. While the abuse itself may well be historic, it's not historic for the victims who have yet to receive justice for what happened to them. As you will hear in this discussion, there are new developments taking place regarding US Congress and Kincora and involving Richard Kerr, one of the most well-known victims of this abuse, who is now a citizen in the United States. Richard is not part of this discussion, but he is absolutely aware of it, and he will be part of a separate interview. My guests today are Father Sean McManus, who is an author and leading human rights activist based in Washington, DC. He played a vital role in the Irish peace process in the US and leads the Irish National Caucus lobby group. I also have Andrew Loney. He's a Sunday Times best-selling author who's written extensively about the Mountbattens and Lord Louis Mountbatten's paedophile activities. I also have Colin Wallace. He's a former captain in British Army intelligence who blew the whistle on sexual abuse at Kincora. He was subsequently framed by MI5 for manslaughter and overturned this on appeal. He has spent his life campaigning for justice for the boys who were abused. I also have Donald Lavery, who is a commentator and a journalist in Belfast who's written for Village Magazine Ireland about the Kincora boys' home scandal. And we've also talked about it as well, Donald, haven't we? And last, but certainly not least, I have John McMahon. John studied law and emigrated to the US after suffering horrific abuse by a member of this child abuse ring that we will be discussing. He was refused participation in the historical institutional abuse inquiry and has become a confidant to Richard Kerr. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I thought we'd do is we'd start out, first of all, and I'd invite all of you to give us an introduction of your role in this story and how you're contributing to it, because I'd like to make everybody clear the people you're seeing on the screen are experts about this subject, absolute experts. So settle in and be prepared, possibly to have your mind blown, but this is a story that must be told and no stone must be left unturned. So I would like to invite, first of all, Donald, for you to give us an overview of what the Kincora boys' home scandal is.
Well, I first encountered that term Kincora when I was a teenager, when I read a book called God and the Gun by Martin Dillon. And basically, the word Kincora refers to a boys' welfare home in East Belfast, but it has become synonymous with basically state cover-up of child sexual abuse and how it was being used as, in effect, what colloquially we would call a honeypot to trap paedophiles and perverts within both the unionist political establishment, the British political establishment, but also the loyalist underworld of paramilitaries. It was being heavily used by British intelligence, and by that I mean MI5 and elements of the police special branch here. When the scandal eventually started to unravel in the 70s and it came to fruition in the from 80 to 81, it was during Mrs. Thatcher's tenure. And out of everyone involved in this sort of murky affair, she actually benefited the most from it, because people like her campaign manager, Ari Neve, they were heavily connected to stuff that was going on in Northern Ireland that involved Kincora as a means of discrediting, for example, elected Labour governments of Harold Wilson and so forth in the UK. But I think just to bring it back to the issue of Kincora itself, you had a situation where, a bit like in Portugal, I think it was called the Casapia scandal, where you had young boys were being trafficked out to establishment paedophiles in stately homes, both sides of the Irish border and across the Irish Sea. That includes a young boy who was friends with Richard Kerr, Stephen Mooring, who actually threw himself off the ferry. Such was the extent of the abuse. And I note that Colin Wallace did make a complaint to the police ombudsman mentioning this, and they didn't even acknowledge that when it concerned the suicide and death of a child. That was particularly horrific. But the problem, and I suppose what brings us all together today, is that it has never been properly dealt with, despite the 4 inquiries which Colin has referred to before. They have never had the proper legal powers to compel or subpoena evidence and witnesses. And I think really you would think by the 4th attempt, why would we not have learned from the mistakes of the prior 3? What exactly is it that the British state finds so damning about this particular instance, that they wouldn't permit principles of natural justice in the way that would be standard practice in, for example, the US, with people like Richard and John and so forth? I would imagine just it's reliving a nightmare each day in terms of going over the events and the figures who were involved in this. And of course, people like Colin, who had spent many years in jail as a result of having blown the whistle on it. So I think we're enormously grateful to have him with us today.
Indeed. And actually, let's come to Colin. Colin, when did you first become involved in this story?
In the early 1970s, I was on the staff of British Army headquarters in Northern Ireland, and I had 2 roles. One was as an officer in the Ulster Defence Regiment, and the second one was in psychological operations. Because of the sensitivity of psychological operations, the Ministry of Defence created a false job for me, and it was advertised through the civil service as head of production services. And the idea was to give me access to the media, but I was almost a bridge between the intelligence world and other outlets. So in 1971, part of my plan was to study the paramilitary groups very closely, to collect information and then use that information to disrupt what they were doing. In many ways, we were really playing tensions within the group against each other. And I discovered a group called TARA. It was operating under a title called the Orange Discussion Group in Belfast. TARA, of course, is the old seat of the Irish kings going back to Neolithic times. And it was interesting that what was fundamentally a loyalist group was using a site in the Republic of Ireland. This didn't quite make sense. When I began to look at the people attending the meeting, the first thing was I identified people who'd been involved in the bombing campaign in the late 60s, carried out by loyalists to undermine the then Northern Ireland Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill. And Terence O'Neill, of course, was trying to build rapport between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Clearly, the extreme right-wing people didn't like that. And then, as we looked in more detail, the group also had lots of very respectable middle-aged people. So it was an interesting mixture. But the leader of TARA, the founder of TARA, was a man called William McGrath. And William McGrath was a replica of Elmer Gantry, who appeared with Burt Lancaster many years ago. On the outside world, he was an evangelical preacher, a firebrand preacher. But when we looked at his background, he started off as a barber. He had no educational qualifications, but he ran an Irish mission, a mission to Southern Ireland. And the idea he wanted to convert Southern Irish Catholics to become Protestants. So his big enemies were the Catholic Church, number 1, communism, number 2, and the Irish government, number 3. But his whole rhetoric was really of living a life of purity. Now, when we looked further at this, it seemed a fairly standard type of Northern Irish paramilitary organization. The following year, I discovered that he'd been employed in a boys' home in Belfast. At this stage, I wasn't aware that McGrath was a homosexual, as we called it at that time. But the interesting is that when we looked at this mission he was running, it was residential, and he did a type of psychological counseling for children. And gradually we were beginning to put two and two together. And then, of course, the first allegations came out in 1973, where the army got information that he was, quote, a homosexual. I need to make it clear that McGrath was not a homosexual, and he was not a paedophile. He was a person who wanted to abuse children, full stop. And it was about power. And so he had a long track record that people weren't aware of abusing these children who were sent to him, quite often by clergymen, to sort out various problems they had. So he was very highly regarded, although he had no training whatsoever in this. So the army at that stage then asked if I would plant with the press some of his information. And they actually gave me a document which gave the telephone number of Kincora, the address of Kincora, his telephone number, and his home address, plus the fact that he blackmailed people into homosexuality. Now, that was pretty strong stuff back in 1973 in a part of the world where discussion about sexual matters was virtually non-existent.
Yeah.
Despite that, the press really didn't publish anything because they were so frightened. And part of the problem was that I had also listed in that document a number of key politicians who were linked with McGrath. So that was really where it started. And then literally it moved on from there. In 1974, we got much more information, which I won't dwell on at this stage. But by this stage, I think my attempts to attract the press were then picked up by a senior MI5 officer, and he reported me to MI5 headquarters in London for a breach of security. This was sheer madness because the army had actually given me a written document to give to the press, and they'd actually written that along the top. And here was MI5, the equivalent of the American FBI to some extent, trying to get me stopped by reporting me to his superiors. So immediately you could see that there was a divergence within the security authorities. But then the other issue was that senior members of the RUC were attending McGrath's meetings. So he was getting a lot of support from within the RUC. And that made the whole issue of exposing what was going on virtually impossible. And then at the end of 1974, things were getting more and more difficult. And I was then summoned by my superiors who said I was going to be moved out of Northern Ireland. I was being posted to an army unit in Northern Ireland. And I then gave a restricted document to a journalist, which of course was my prerogative. And then I was charged with a breach of security. I was then put on a disciplinary panel, but I was charged under the false job description that the MOD created for me, not my real job description. And I was required to resign, which I had to do. Years later, the government called in Sir David Calcutt QC to look at this, and he agreed that it was right. And the Metropolitan Police believed that the MOD's actions were fraudulent. In other words, disciplining me under a false job description, but the DPP blocked the police from taking any action.
Right.
And of course, the danger there was that the whole thing would have unraveled at that stage.
John, when we've talked before, one of the things that you were very keen to stress to me was that this has been completely underplayed. It's far more extensive than we've been given the impression that it is. And that really is sort of part of the cover-up, really. Can you give us some understanding of how you know about all of this?
I'm from the Republic of Ireland and grew up in RD. I was abused in 1968 until 1972, age 13 to 17. 68 predates the dates that Colin was giving you about the RUC knowledge. I was abused by Ken Larmer, a Belfast social worker who later became a court official. Ken, in his stance as a social worker, called on the institutional homes and set up private foster home situations. So his relationship with me was almost like a foster parent or a mentor. It coincided when my father first went to hospital, and he was in hospital for the 4 or 5 years dying, that I was being abused. It was happenstance because his friend bought our house in RD, and someone like him sees a vulnerable boy from a mile away.
Yeah, absolutely.
He brought me to Belfast and all over the north and Scotland, actually, and abused me over a course of 4 years, as I say, including the first night he got his hands on me.
I'm very sorry to hear that. How did you come to know Richard?
Because my abuse was in Belfast primarily, and because I had tried to have my case prosecuted in 1995, I became aware of the Kincora story. And the DPP turned my case down because of time and the expense of prosecuting. But in the course of my investigation, the police officer came across a file in which Ken Larmer was documented back in 1970-71 as having provided his flat on the Shore Road in Belfast to Alan Campbell for sexual abuse of a young boy from one of the institutional homes. So I became aware of Kincora, the story around that period of time, but it was also the connection to Kincora that ensured that the DPP would not prosecute. I also tried to get involved with the HIA inquiry, but was not allowed to participate because I was not a resident of an institutional home. So in essence, twice thwarted. I later had a chance to connect with Richard in the US. I live in the northeast of the US. Richard lives 4,000 miles away. And in a way, through Colin, I think it was, connected us. And I reached out, we talked, and then I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and decided I was going to drive 1,000 miles and meet Richard. And that was maybe 3 years ago. So we connected, we've talked a lot, and we have different points of view, different perspectives. And in a way, what's fascinating is my situation was very different. It was not within the institutional homes, but the same names keep on coming up. And we're talking about 1968, not 1972 or 3, when some of the RUC knowledge started coming. So in a way, because I didn't have a chance for justice, I want to make damn sure that Richard does.
Yeah.
His writ came to the High Court in 2016. It's already 5 years going on six years. He thought the case would be heard in 2019. It may be heard in the spring. It's been delayed for many reasons, but obviously the government, the state, has made a practice of slowing things down, hoping that the plaintiffs die in the meantime, or else that they bankrupt them. So my role here is to be a friend and a support for Richard, but also to help make sure he gets over the finish line and gets justice. If he gets justice, it will be justice for me and for many others who haven't had a chance.
So that brings us very neatly to Father Sean McManus, who also desires greatly justice for the victims, including absolutely Richard Kerr. Father, please tell us what's happening regarding the Irish National Caucus and Congress.
Well, when Donald Lavery contacted the Irish National Caucus, he asked if we could do for Richard Kerr what we had done for Raymond McCord. In other words, raise that issue in the United States Congress. Raymond McCord, another Protestant from Belfast, his son was murdered in 1997. And because the people involved in ordering it and planning it and executing the murder were associated with British intelligence and police informers, the British government covered it up and has covered it up until this very moment. We were proud and honored to raise Richard's case because we knew that when Protestant Unionists in Northern Ireland become whistleblowers against the British government, they are shunned and abandoned by the Protestant community,
Right.
increasing the pain and suffering 1,000-fold. Colin knows of which I speak. We have made this point to Congress, that although Richard's abuse happened in the 70s, and although it is sort of an old case, it is ever fresh in the victim's mind, and that Richard still has not got justice. And that is very relevant because Richard is a United States citizen and living in Texas, and that the British government is still denying him justice. The British government still covers up the truth that their police and intelligence agencies knew all about the abuse and were using that abuse as a means of compromising the abusers for political advantage. The Irish National Caucus has briefed and continues to inform the offices of key members of Congress and key committees. And we do this in the belief and in the knowledge that the one thing the British government fears above all else is public opinion in the United States Congress and in the US government.
Yes.
Indeed, the almost 50 years work of the Irish National Caucus is based on that fundamental principle. And that now applies more than ever before because there is very strong support at the very top of the US government and in the US Congress for justice and peace in Ireland. And that is further strengthened at the moment because of President Biden's deal with Britain and Australia. So now, those in Northern Ireland who are opposed to justice and want to bring Northern Ireland back 100 years to its creation, now they must ask themselves this question. Really, who does Boris Johnson need more? Us, meaning them, or President Biden?
So, Andrew, last but not least, so what we're dealing with here is an Anglo-Irish vice ring. Now, you have obviously, you have a number of best-selling books about historic characters, the Spy Ring, which I've discussed with you before in interview, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Do you feel that there is any involvement with any of these people regarding this particular paedophile ring?
Well, as you say, I'm a general biographer. I stumbled across the story researching a biography of Lord Mountbatten. And I found papers in the FBI, an FBI file on him saying that he had a reputation. This is a file from the Second World War, saying that he had a reputation for abusing children. And so that interested me and I began to explore it further. And I was put in touch with who I interviewed together with another boy who was also abused by Mountbatten. And I'm trying as a historian to evaluate evidence. And I was pretty convinced, I was putting my reputation on the line, that these people were telling the truth. And the research sort of led on from that to show that Mountbatten was part of, I think, a wider abuse ring operating in Ireland. And some of the figures, names we talked about have crossed over, in a sense, my desk as well. And what I've also found was when I tried to find out more, I do a lot of work with archives and freedom of information requests, those requests were rejected or they were attempting to suppress what I was doing. So, for example, when Kincora files were released eventually after going to the Information Commissioner, the files have been heavily weeded. Requests to Garda for example, the car registration plate for August 1977, when Richard was abused, were refused, even though they admitted they had them, saying they were linked to a murder inquiry, a murder that took place 2 years later. So there are lots and lots of unanswered questions for me as a historian through my work on Mountbatten. And it's also clear that Mountbatten was a regular visitor to Belfast. And there are certainly, it's easy to make a case that he may well have gone there himself as part of his paedophile activities. One new disclosure is I've been fighting for the diaries and letters of Mountbatten, which were bought by the public, for the public, and were closed illegally. And we're now getting close to getting those diaries and letters released. We've got the letters and diaries up to 1960, but for some reason they're withholding the letters for the last 20 years of his life and the diaries. And you have to wonder why. And you have to also wonder why the security when he was killed at a time when there was an enhanced threat to his life was actually reduced. So for me as a historian, there are a lot of unanswered questions which don't quite add up in terms of what's happened.
Thank you. I feel that one of the problems is that we've obviously had this issue of a VIP paedophile ring, and it's been discredited. And so obviously this then, and it's been discredited very carefully with great craft, obviously, we know this, but obviously what it then does is it tends to discredit the actual story. Yes. But so let's go back to this. I mean, the absolute claim is that British intelligence and police used the home, Kincora, but not just Kincora. There was also abuse at Williamson House as well, wasn't there? As a means to trap and compromise the abusers. Would somebody expand on that for me?
Well, I think there are two questions there. The first one is where you discredit people who make allegations. In my old job, that's exactly what we would do. We would set someone up and then we would undermine that person, because then that person undermines everyone else who comes into the circle. So it's absolutely standard procedure. And once you see that happening, you begin to realize that just didn't happen by accident. Right. But I think you see, when you look at McGrath was very important, because what lots of people don't realize was he had strange connections in Dublin, for example. We know that he attended conferences in Dublin in the 70s, attended by people from the Soviet Union. Now, in the 70s, you could not leave the Soviet Union unless you were a guaranteed dyed-in-the-wool communist. So the fact that they were coming to events allegedly for European Christians didn't make sense. But worse than that, those people also stayed at his hostel, his Irish mission in Belfast. So the police knew about that. Secondly, when you look at the VIP side, one of the key figures whose land was used by Tara for military training was a guy called Peter Montgomery. He was the deputy lieutenant for County Tyrone. He had been in a long-term homosexual relationship with Anthony Blunt. Now, we targeted him, not Blunt, but Montgomery, deliberately, because, of course, he was part of the Northern Ireland scene. Although Blunt was living under immunity at that stage from prosecution, I never heard Blunt's name being mentioned. Right. So clearly, the information I was getting, he was being snowpicked out of it. Montgomery was very important. He was a cousin of Field Marshal Montgomery. He was an intelligence officer during World War II. He was part of the Cambridge ring of Burgess, Philby, and Maclean. Absolutely. Now, nobody is going to tell me that he was traveling back and forward regularly to Northern Ireland and the special branch didn't know. Yeah. This is the type of huge cover-up. And I mean massive. Yeah. It's not small stuff. It's indisputable. But yet, when we came to have the Terry inquiry, the first inquiry into Kincora, James Pryor told Parliament he would bring in an independent police officer to supervise the RUC. He brought in Sir George Terry. George Terry wasn't in the point. He was actually requested by John Herman. John Herman wanted him to know. And surprise, surprise, Sir George Terry found out that MI5 had instructed an army intelligence officer who followed me into Lisburn, who reported Kincora, who wrote a report. He ordered him to stop investigating. Parliament was never told about that by Sir George Terry. If Parliament had been told, there would have been outrage, there would have been then a proper inquiry. Now, at that point, you have to say, bearing in mind the police knew all about this and Whitehall knew all about this, they all allowed Parliament to be misled. And to me, that is a total attempt to undermine the integrity of the democratic process that we have. And it gets worse when you get to the Hughes inquiry. Judge Hughes, I thought, was a great person to run that. Parliament was assured he could investigate anything that he liked. When he actually got his terms of reference, he was specifically excluded from investigating army intelligence or MI5. And we have that in writing. And he was really upset about it. So the key issue that people were worried about in Northern Ireland, they believed that that was within Hughes' remit. It wasn't. He never got a chance to look at it. Right. Yet Parliament has done nothing about it. And that is what's frustrating for everybody here, is our democratic system is not working. That's why we go to people like Father Sean outside the UK to try and get the justice that really should happen in time.
Absolutely. Father Sean, Kincora was a Protestant boys' home. Is there a religious element to the blackmail that was going on?
Sonia, I'm having a little problem in understanding you.
Sorry. Kincora was a Protestant boys' home. Do you feel that there was a religious element to the abuse or the blackmail that was taking place, or is that not the case?
I would see it more as an abuse of power and authority. And of course, that can be used by any religious group as a further weapon, but it's fundamentally about power. I have a saying, for example, that if had the Catholics been Jews in Northern Ireland for the past 100 years, the British government and others would have used the tool of anti-Semitism. So it's really about supremacy. It has always been about supremacy, and religion and ethnicity and social background, all of those are simply tools. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not dangerous tools, they're deadly tools. So ironically enough, I think now, strangely enough, that Americans will have a better understanding of the problem in Northern Ireland now than ever before, even though it's not always in the news now. And that's because of January the 6th, the storming of the United States Capitol, for goodness sake, by white supremacists.
Right.
People who had no reason to storm anything. You know, if slaves had stormed the Capitol, well, at least there'd be an explanation. There'd be a reason. There'd be a cause. But middle-aged, privileged people from the privileged class have been told that they're losing supremacy. And that's how they were manipulated. And today, I think in Northern Ireland, we're seeing signs of that. That the fear of the rank and file Protestant that, oh, we're no longer top of the heap, we're no longer number one, that fear can be exploited. And I see clearly, and I think Americans see clearly, the attempts to get unionists, loyalists, Protestants, whatever, back on the street protesting is just like what happened here a few months ago. So whatever way one analyzes this issue, it's always about supremacy.
Right. Right, and
But
these
I
young
think Donald
boys.
maybe has more insight into Kincora than I do have, you know.
Well, I mean, so Donald, let's come to you, Donald. So obviously the story is quite clear, and that is there appears to be a state collusion with the cover-up of this in order to compromise and blackmail people. From all of your research, what can you tell us?
Well, just on the point that Father Sean was mentioning, one of the things that I would differentiate in that if you take some of the sex abuse scandals that have happened in the various different churches and religious organizations, right? The reason that they have been more robustly dealt with than, say, this instance of Kincora is because they're private legal entities, which you can drag through the court. Whereas if you're taking the government itself to court, it has an endless pot of resources and money, and also it has the power to change laws, which we cannot amend, so to speak. So Colin has, I think, cited the best example of that in the fact that 4 inquiries into this have still not produced anything by way of transparency. Regarding the religious aspect of Kincora, it was, I mean, there were staff there that were involved in evangelical extremism and right-wing extremism. That's certainly true. They were evangelical Protestants. You had a very, very right-wing British unionism. That I think you could draw parallels with the sort of rednecks, white supremacists over in America. That certainly exists, and the people here who were running Kincora, some of them were involved in bringing down a government in the 70s during the Sunningdale Agreement in 1974, and that was the first attempt by all sides to try to get Catholics and Protestants to share power. So they destabilized the situation as a means of destabilizing democracy in Britain under Harold Wilson and Edward Heath. And the purpose of that was that the people in MI5, the ultras right-wing element, they felt that back then that Heath was too weak to take on the unions. They also said that he may have been a homosexual and that Harold Wilson was a Soviet agent. Both, I think that was rubbish. The intention behind that was undoubtedly to place a far more right-wing figure at the helm of the Conservative Party who could use the issue of Kincora, right? Because direct rule had been introduced by the wet Tories, right? And so some of the abuse that Colin has spoken about happened under the sort of the Heath wing, the wet Tory element, who had started to run Northern Ireland when the Unionist government was prorogued here. Margaret Thatcher used that to blackmail the elements in her party who could otherwise depose her. I mean, the fact that Ari Neve, her front man, he had been in contact with Colin in the run-up to the elections and so forth in 1974, I think. And thereafter, Neve was, as you know, killed in the House of Commons in very mysterious circumstances. But it's hard to believe that all of that was going on and that Neve would never have discussed that with Thatcher herself, who then went on to, she misled Parliament several times relating to the Kincora affair. And I mean, a minister is supposed to resign if that's the case. She never told Parliament about the issue of Brian Gemmell, the other intelligence officer who had discovered what Colin had, because if she had done that, then there would have had to be a full public inquiry. And all of the, well, a lot of the dirt would have pointed back to her, the fact that she was using this information for her own dirty political ends.
Right. So it's very we've been subject to very selective information, haven't we? I mean, the facts that we know, in 1981, 3 senior staff were convicted of the abuse of 11 boys at Kincora. But it's always been very sort of shut about the issue of it being Anglo and Irish. John, I want to bring you in here because, as we both know, Richard was trafficked and he was taken from Ireland. So what can you tell us about that, about the trafficking from Ireland? Oh, hello, John?
I didn't hear you. what I can tell you is, the human story here is that Richard was taken from his parents at the age of 5, and over the next couple of years, he was obviously prepped by Joe Maines. By the age of 8, he was digitally raped. By age of 10, trafficking on a limited basis started. That was all Williamson House. Williamson House was designed for young children as young as infants up to the age of 13, 14. He was sent to Kincora, having already been with hundreds of men. At the age of 14, Kincora was a working boys hostel designed for 16 to 18-year-olds. And the government at times even added a year to his age because obviously adults would react differently hearing that somebody had sex with a 17-year-old versus a 16-year-old. But Richard was 8 and 10 years of age when this started. He met a number of people, some of whom were American business people who traveled to Belfast and the Europa Hotel. He met them. People like Roy Cohn went to London and Belfast. All those people were very interconnected. Richard was brought to France and Italy and all over the place. He was 14 years of age. He had no money. Somebody was paying for his trips. He had photographs of himself in Venice, and yet he was formerly a resident of a home. So his ability to move in and out of that home was not based on him slipping out in the middle of the night. The managers knew, and McGrath had the reputation as being the senior guy there, but Joe Maines was the guy really that Richard talked about as being the prime guy. Richard spent a lot of time overseas in England and London, in the Midlands, in France, Italy. He went on the Orient Express. Ultimately, when Kincora started spilling out, it was because Richard's social workers were trying to report the sexual problems going on to their superiors. Their superiors did nothing about it, so eventually, out of frustration, the social workers leaked the story to the Irish Times in the Republic of Ireland, and then that's how the story broke.
Right.
And that's in that period when the story started breaking. When the inquiry was happening, the initial inquiry was happening, Richard was in London, and he was sent to America with paperwork that was provided to him within a period of 24 hours of request. So he got his visa to come to the US, and he was supported for most of the rest of his life in the US by the people who abused him, some of the people who abused him, American business people. And he remained under their control until they died, I'll call it 8 years ago. So that is when he started getting professional therapy and help and started recognizing what happened. And he's been dealing with that since. His high court writ was March of 2016. He thought the case would go to court in late 2019. It's late 2021 now. He doesn't have a date yet. The KRW law has requested a date, a set down date, and we believe it'll be in the spring. But it's frustrating as hell for somebody to try and get justice. He pulled out of the HIA inquiry because it was clear the terms of reference were messed around with, and he couldn't compel witnesses. And also his lawyers were hit with hundreds of pages of documents 36 to 40 hours before he was due to sit there. So they knew it was a travesty of justice and pulled out. But his evidence, his file is part of that record, and even that record was messed around with. So there's been many attempts to mess around with his reputation, including people trying to tie him to Carl Beach, that he was trying to get information from Carl Beach versus the other way around. There are many ways that the authorities will mess with you, but clearly their goal is to slow walk this so that maybe Richard dies from stress before it ever gets to court.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
So, Sonia,
Andrew. Oh, yes.
It's just one of the points that John had mentioned that I wanted just to follow up on is that one of Richard's abusers, this paedophile psychiatrist, Maurice Fraser, the celebrity psychiatrist they used to
Who you're writing a book about.
Yes. Maurice Fraser, a convicted paedophile, both in the UK, he was convicted in London, also convicted over in America, in New York County. But Maurice Fraser, people have submitted freedom of information requests about him because it's known that he did abuse Richard, and Richard has gone public with that. The police service here have refused those on grounds of national security.
Right, and now that is exactly what I wanted to just cover with Andrew. Andrew, what were you hoping to acquire when you applied to the Garda for the Kincora papers?
Well, I wanted to find out more information about if there were links, for example, between Mountbatten and Kincora, or some of the people that he mixed with. Right. In the same way that when I asked for the number plates, it was to be able to trace those number plates and to see who came to Classiborn at that time. And if one could then find people like Joe Mains, then one would have some of the evidence that one could build one's case with. But in some ways, they're not allowing you to build any case because everything gets refused. And I mean, there are stories of the Garda just burning documents and putting them out to sea. I mean, you know, these are public documents that should be kept for posterity. They're not for them to destroy.
What do you make of this, the fact that it is so difficult for you to acquire this information? And you, for example, you were certainly the first person to break officially what the FBI thought about Mountbatten as one example. So you go in very deeply with your research. What do you make of such reluctance to have this story fully looked at?
Well, no one wants the story out. And I mean, one of the exemptions under freedom of information is foreign relations, section 27. And I think that was used in this, because what I discovered was looking at the file numbers, I was able to call up other file numbers of other people connected with Mountbatten. And when I requested those files, they were told they'd been destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I discovered they'd been destroyed after I asked for them. They'd been kept for 40 years and then destroyed just at the very point I asked for them. So they've been sitting there. No one had realized they were there. And as soon as they did realize, presumably with liaison with the British, the Americans destroyed them.
I mean, that's just extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, as a journalist, every sort of red flag in me would shoot up at the idea of them destroying evidence after you've asked for it, after it's been sitting around for 40 years.
Well, I think the Americans were uncomfortable about this, and that's why they told me. They could have just said it'd been lost or didn't have it or couldn't find it or whatever. The fact they told me that, I think, suggested that they wanted to flag this up. They weren't happy about this.
Right.
I mean, they could have just said it's not possible under Section 27. But I think they wanted under Section 27. I could well have then tried to get public interest tests and fought the thing. This was basically a final answer. There's no point going on because it's not there.
I mean, this is extraordinary. Colin, one of the things that you did, obviously, is you wrote to Margaret Thatcher, didn't you?
Several times.
Yeah. And what did you tell her?
Oh, I said out in considerable detail within the terms of the Official Secrets Act, because all the way through, I was not allowed to discuss any of this other than the material that I'd been cleared to release. But what happened is, you see, that the people who gave me the documents later on denied that they knew anything at all about it. And I was only very lucky because I managed to acquire some documents where these people, who were good friends of mine, I worked closely with them, but they were put under severe pressure from Whitehall to admit that we were looking at this. Because once you admit you're looking at it, the question is why, and then Absolutely. The story is wide open. But it goes deeper than this. You see, first of all, it's unlawful to destroy official documents unless there is a destruction certificate. When I left Northern Ireland, I handed over all of my material on Tara and all sorts of similar projects. And in 1980, when McGrath was finally identified and subsequently charged, what we've now discovered from official documents is that all of the documents in my unit, PSYOPs, all of the documents were destroyed in 1980 and in 1982. That was when he was convicted. Now, isn't it an amazing coincidence that those were all destroyed? 1989, the MOD carried out an inquiry into my role in Northern Ireland, and I've got extracts from the findings. And the MOD official who investigated it said that they had still not been able to interview those people who had ordered the destruction of the documents. Now, this is almost 30 years on, and they still haven't investigated those people. Because if they told the truth, again, the whole thing would be open. So what you have is an incestuous cover-up. Yes. And it's like spaghetti. Once you pull out one piece, it leads to another. And what they have just done deliberately is shut it down. The minutes of the Northern Ireland Office, Intelligence Services, when the Terry inquiry finished, they were really worried about a public inquiry. And the minutes are fascinating. First of all, they said the director of intelligence was really worried about this because it would open up all sorts of things. And the first thing they asked was that they wanted a Great Britain judge, not a Northern Ireland judge. So that was attempted to manipulate it. And then the second thing was they were going to brief the Secretary of State about the dangers of having a public inquiry, and that there should be an inquiry only into the administration of the homes. That is precisely what happened. So what is happening is our elected politicians, who are supposed to be representing us and the Richards of this world, they are actually being manipulated by the system, not by the democratic process. That is really what is frightening about all of this.
Absolutely. How has this impacted your life, Colin, being a whistleblower to this?
It's been traumatic, obviously, spending 7 years in prison for something you didn't do, and then finding that the forensic evidence was actually rigged by a pathologist, and he claimed he got the information from the American Secret Service. This is all on record of the court, and yet with all, nobody's got prosecuted for this.
Yeah,
that's horrendous. I was quite lucky because all the people I worked closely with couldn't talk to me anymore. I really was shut off from everything. But I had a number of very good people who took big risks to keep me posted. The annoying thing is, I think I grew up my family were Scots originally. I grew up in a Presbyterian world where basically everything I believed in turned out to be nonsense. And that's what's hurt me more than anything else.
Understood.
People I knew were really good. They were very ordinary people. They believed, like me, British justice was the fairest in the world. And it's nonsense. People don't realize how much manipulation goes on because it's not visible. And it's very rare. It's taken me 40 years to get hold of some of the documents that I was handling at that time. And Whitehall knew this. They knew that when I went to prison, it was wrong. They knew when I was removed from Northern Ireland, it was wrong. They still did it.
Yeah. Father, one of the things that you said to me when we talked was the importance of, once Congress are interested, then it becomes more of interest to the British government, for example, who is exactly who we need to get the attention of. Where do you think we sort of stand a chance in getting that? Because obviously we're talking about an extensive cover-up over many decades that involves many people, some still alive, in very influential positions. So what do you think the chances are of the British government actually finally paying attention and addressing this issue?
Well, I think that they're very concerned, even at this moment. The British Embassy, I know, is deeply concerned that this very embarrassing, annoying thing that has now emerged, Richard's case, that key members of Congress, for example, Richie Neal's office, and Richie is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And that's the committee that any trade agreement with Britain and the United States. That has to go through that committee. And Richie has made it very clear. If you harm the Good Friday, and all the legacy denial stuff, you know, you're not going to get a trade agreement. And Speaker Nancy, God bless her, has said exactly the same thing. And Joe Biden has exactly said the same thing. Now, when you think of 50 years ago and 40 years ago, when we started this work, for goodness sake, it would have been impossible to believe that the President of the United States would come out so publicly on any issue regarding Ireland. Their policy was strictly hands off, hands off. That's a British sphere of influence. We have no say. And the previous speakers of the House were practically useless. And in my humble, Fermanagh opinion, the American government, the word collusion keeps appearing here. And I know deeply how Colin felt when his government and his army and his police and his courts and the whole trappings of British power that unionists cling to and admire turned against him. You see, when that happens to a Catholic, when he's mistreated at home, you know, unless they're really damaged, they can almost wear it as a badge of honor. But when it happens to a Colin or a Raymond McCord, and I've heard Raymond talk about this, you know, his army, his police, his government. And every time he said, my government, I'd always say, but not mine, Raymond. They felt it terribly deeply. And now, I think what is extremely difficult for the British Embassy and the British government to deal with, they've almost come to terms with, yes, there was collusion. And yes, we were involved in the killing of Pat Finucane and a lot of Catholics. They've come to terms with that. But you also mistreated Protestants. You killed McCord's son. You did this to Richard. You did this to Colin. That's almost an impossible thing for them to respond to. So I think these cases point more vividly and dramatically, at least to my mind, of collusion. Collusion was always seen of collusion against Catholics and et cetera, the usual stuff. And it could all be dismissed as, it's a very Irish anti-British line. But you know what? When I brought Raymond McCord into Congressman Delahunt, who was the chairman of the subcommittee, and within minutes, we had the promise of a hearing, because I began by saying, and then turned it over to Raymond, Congressman, you've heard me for years talk about how the British colluded in the murder of Catholics in Northern Ireland. Today, I bring a staunch Protestant, a staunch unionist, to tell you how the government were involved in the killing and the cover-up of his son. And I could see everything changed. Right. Everything changed, because this was giving Congress people, oh my goodness, this is not just Irish Catholic propaganda.
Right.
So this issue now, and it comes as somewhat of a surprise to me, that this issue now is penetrating the whole business of collusion, maybe more than everything else. So for example, Raymond McCord told me the other day that his case is now going to Section 3, the private court. He can't be represented in it. And Colin may know more about this. Maybe, Colin, you can explain what that court is.
Well, this is closed session where the public are not admitted. There's only the judge and the barristers must be security cleared. So this means that you really narrow it down. So it prevents any information from getting outside that. And they were trying to do this with me when I was going to be called to give evidence to the Hughes Committee. But then eventually, when the army was excluded, that was a different thing. But just, I want to make one point that to pick up what Father Sean had. One person we didn't mention today, who is key to this whole story, is a man called Roy Garland. He was McGrath's number 2. He was an Orangeman. He was abused by McGrath when he was a teenager. And in 1971, when I discovered Tara, Roy Garland was desperately trying to tell everybody. He left Tara. He went to see the leaders of the Orange Order. They didn't want to know. He went to the police. He was interviewed by a detective. That detective, over months, wrote a report and gave it to the head of the CID. The head of the CID lost the file. That's what you're up against. And nobody tried harder than anybody who's talked to Roy Garland. Here's a man whose life was totally ruined. He was college lecturer, he made good, but nobody, and if they had listened to him in 1971, years of abuse, 2 years before I started, could have been prevented.
Well, I've heard you say that before, because once you blew the whistle, it was after you blew the whistle that Richard actually went to Kincora, and that could have been prevented. Absolutely. If they'd have listened to you then. And so it's absolutely outrageous. Donald, I want to come to you because obviously we want to give it some historical context. This was all taking place during the Troubles. What relevance is the Troubles to this discussion?
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Colin. No, go ahead, Colin.
I think very little, because one of the things I was going to say to you today, the Troubles is quite often put up as an excuse. Right. Now, I'm not minimizing that. During the Troubles, we have to remember 3,700 people died. And during my time there, we had, I think from memory, we had 16,000 bombings and 30-odd thousand shootings. So there was a huge loss of life. Army lost 700 people, the RUC lost 300. But fundamentally, that should not be used as an excuse for not investigating information that's presented to the authorities. I lived through it. Life was absolutely mad at that stage. I had no leave for 6 years, just simply because of the pile of work. But if we had been given the authority to have investigated, we would have done it. And I believe any police force would have done exactly the same. Sadly, child abuse is not an army activity. That was one of the problems we had. We were not allowed to investigate non-paramilitary people. But don't mistake me, there were people in the RUC who were really good, I mean that, who would have done a good job if they had felt they could get away with it, and they couldn't.
Right. But children were just used as some sort of capital, weren't they? Because obviously very powerful people who were, because this was like, so Kincora was essentially a sort of, I think I've heard you describe it, Father Sean, as like a male brothel in which paedophiles went to, and some of these were very high, powerful men. And linked to, are we talking about linked to military? We're talking about linked to the secret services, linked to governments. Donald?
I would say that what you have is a nexus of power that they're linked to, and that, I mean, I would say if you had a genuinely open democratic society, many of these people would have been charged and prosecuted for misfeasance in public office.
Right.
That would be my central element, including, by the way, if I had the power to do it, the pathologist, which Colin mentioned in terms of the proceedings against him by the Home Office, I would have charged them with misfeasance in public office.
Right.
In the sense that that would send out a clear signal in that it would be a deterrent for them to continue, a deterrent against them continuing to do these sort of things. But in terms of the actual political and historical aspect of it, Kincora predates the Troubles in that there was abuse going on there from the 60s. The thing is, some of the figures who were caught up in it, what one of the second Army intelligence officer, Brian Gemmell, one of the questions that he posed before was that this mysterious organization, Tara, which was led by some of these pedophiles, was it simply an organization that reacted to events, or was it one that was more proactive and could massage events? And was it basically part of a counterinsurgency apparatus that was, well, put it this way, my own view is that the British intelligence services witnessed the civil rights movement and so forth going on here. They seen what it was leading to, how there was a real push for reform and so forth, particularly against the sort of gerrymandered anti-Catholic discrimination that had taken place for so long. And they wanted to enact counterinsurgency type policies in what is termed a part of the United Kingdom, including running Latin American style death squads. And the way essentially to do that was to compromise elements of the Unionist Protestant loyalist community. People like William McGrath, people like Ian Paisley, who was compromised by the Kincora scandal, in that not that Paisley was sexually abusing children, but that he was friends with McGrath. Two of McGrath's children were married in Paisley's church. He also, McGrath knew about Paisley's role in the bombing campaign to get one of the previous prime ministers of Northern Ireland out of office. So there's no way that when the whistleblowers came forward, like Colin, like Roy Garden, like Valerie Shaw, like Brian Gemmell, there's no way Paisley was going to turn around and say that he knew about McGrath's sexual abuse of children and so forth, because McGrath would then point the finger back at him. Colin referred to it as being like spaghetti, where it opened, it brings something else forward. And that's the problem, in that I think that if you properly open the books relating to this, you would have no government.
Right. Well, that brings me to Andrew, actually. Andrew, as a historian, do you find it perfectly feasible that the state would cover up for powerful people?
Yes, of course. I find it all the time with my research. And I'm amazed that there aren't some whistleblowers who at least pop up. It is a huge operation. There must be many people involved in it, but I think they're frightened about losing their jobs, and so they cover it up, knowing things are wrong. But absolutely, it keeps, it goes on and on. I've just done a book on the Duke of Windsor, and it's very clear there was a cover up there to cover his activities as a Nazi sympathizer. And it's my argument that our history is censored. It's censored right at the beginning with the government departments, but then they try and, if one then begins to find things like the FBI files, they then move in to try and censor it from other sources as well.
Right. Or close it for 75 to 100 years or whatever, it's one tactic after another, isn't it, really? So what I'd like to do is use the final 5 minutes just for whatever anybody feels that they haven't been able to say that they'd like to say. So anybody like to go first?
Sonia, on that point that you asked Andrew there, one of the things which I think everyone would agree on in terms of a valid question is whether this practice is still being used in Northern Ireland and afar. Now, not necessarily so much the children in welfare homes are being explicitly sexually abused as such in the way that they were at Kincora or Trafficked, but is knowledge of a compromising nature sexually still being used to compromise and trap prominent politicians, whether they be in Northern Ireland, whether they be in Britain, America, anywhere, and that, I think that's a very valid point, because if someone's standing for public office, I mean, you need to be able to, see their cards on the table. You need to be able to hold them to account in an open and transparent way. And this is something which in a sense, perverts the democratic process.
Right. And obviously, while it remains so covered up, nothing can heal. Not really. The people involved can't begin to heal from it, can they?
No. And I don't think, I mean, in terms of, you look at many, I mean, the victims and survivors here relating to, let's say, Kincora or Williamson House. I mean, that trauma is still very much there, because once you have one of these inquiries, the four that Colin has mentioned, and they again produce the same result, you know, maybe a small bit more information is released into the public domain. It adds another, you know, it's another slap in the face, it's another insult. And I mean, in terms of the stuff that's going on with Congress and trying to involve the American legislator in this issue of Kincora, I think that's particularly pertinent in that I don't actually believe that the British government will arrive at this sort of arrive at a decision to come clean about it at their own behest. I mean, it's something that you're almost going to have to kick the door in,
right,
before any sort of closure is provided.
Yeah, I mean, yes, go on, Colin.
Sorry, I'm going to have to leave you in a second.
Yes.
Can I just pick up on what Donald said? The key thing about all of this is what we call collateral damage. People
Yes.
give intelligence for three reasons. One is for money. One is because they're under duress. And the other one is because they want revenge on someone. Those are the three big tools that we would use. And quite clearly, the children who get abused, they are the collateral.
Yes.
It's the target. The person who's abusing them is the one who's then under pressure to work for the authorities. That's the sad thing about it. The children do not feature other than for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. Would anybody else like to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and just bring it back to Richard here, which is the center of it. He did not leave England and Northern Ireland voluntarily, and I want to make that clearly.
Right.
And the timing of his disappearance, he suddenly left England when the inquiry, the original inquiry, was taking heat, and it opened up after the suicide of Steve Waring. He was sent to the United States, and that paperwork was arranged, and he got his paperwork behind the U.S. Embassy in London. Now, who the heck do you think can arrange stuff like that quickly? And he was under the control of people, both financially and otherwise, emotionally, for the next 30, 40 years. He was out of the jurisdiction. So he was set aside. The state took care of the court records, the RUC records, and the military records. And if you look at the whole scenario here, it's a very wide net to protect the data, and including one of the central witnesses. And the question I would ask now is, think about Richard Kerr's High Court case and what that represents, and whether he will be allowed to get to court next spring. You should keep a close eye on that.
Yes.
And understand what is going on in the court system and who is causing delays.
Yeah.
And whether they are normal or not, because the issue is that Richard's case, if it gets into court, will be kind of out of the control of the authorities, subject to judges and the defense saying that evidence is not admissible in court or whatever. So that is the wild card on this. When everything else has failed, Richard's High Court case may have the best chance of opening up the evidence. And he's not looking for sensationalism. He's simply trying to get the truth out and get somebody to apologize and recognizing the harm that was done to an 8-year-old boy and his family. His siblings were impacted by this as well.
I just want to say thank you so much to all of our guests: Colin Wallace, Andrew Loney, Donald Lavery, John McMahon, Father Sean McManus. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. I fully support what you are doing in raising awareness to this, and let's hope that we can finally open this up the way that it should have been decades ago. Thank you once again, all of you, for joining this discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Tony.